As you have already noticed, that's the wrong gospel. This is the Transfiguration gospel. So we'll just shorten it. Listen to what it says here. Let's see here. Let's go back up to the top here. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the light. His clothes became white as light. That's the short version. I practice this all the time. See, I told you I even make mistakes. They were worried because it's their first time, but they're doing just fine. Now, dearest family, the Transfiguration. There are 2 points in this that I'd like to point out to you. First of all, as Jesus is transfigured, we know that there is Peter, James, and John. And so something happens between them that had never happened before, and that is to be able to see God as he really is. In the Transfiguration, what you see is the Jesus of heaven. Did you hear what I said? The Jesus of heaven. No persons had seen such a thing in the world prior to that experience. And of course, they're overwhelmed. Now, as Jesus and his disciples were doing their work, excuse me, would you please bring me that glass of water? That's not in the script. Thank you very much. You're good. I'm going to keep it. You can't have it back. The Jesus that the apostles saw during their training, it's the real Jesus, but it's not the Jesus of heaven. So you can imagine what it was like. Having been a missionary, I know a piece of this really well. Because in the evening when I would sit with my group of people, because we would go on patrol to other villages, then at night, after it got dark, we would wash up and then have some supper, and then we'd talk about what we experienced during the day. And that's exactly what the apostles did with Jesus. And one of the things, and you can imagine this, sometimes Jesus was tired, so he would turn in early. And you can imagine what the apostles would be talking about. They would say, "Did you see what he did today? That guy was really sick, and now he's not." Then they would look, and he's sound asleep, and they see that peacefulness, that wonderful sense of just drifting into that wonderful sleep. And they would say, "You know, he really is like us. He really is like us." And they had this sense of awe, but still did not understand fully who this Jesus was. Now, the next point is this. You have Mount Tabor, where the Transfiguration takes place. The next serious happening that will challenge that would be when Jesus is hanging on the cross. At the foot of that cross is Mary, Mary's sister, and Mary of Magdala. And by force, he didn't really want to be there, is St. John. He went there grudgingly. And we know something about that exchange. And one of the big purposes of the Transfiguration is to help these 3 apostles, together with the other group, to endure what was going to happen in the next few hours when Jesus, being nailed to the cross, would finally die. And I've mentioned this to you before. Part of the grief of the apostles was, we killed God. They were simply overwhelmed. They didn't know what to do. And in those hours before Jesus, they see the risen Jesus, was the worst experience you could ever imagine. And that would mark their ministry from that point all the way forward. In 3 days, plus or minus a few hours, that Jesus that they saw die on the cross, that Jesus that they saw at the Transfiguration, the Jesus of heaven, is now walking among them because he was raised up by the Father. They were just so overcome with gratefulness that this Jesus is now back among them. And what this signifies, among other things, is there are terrible and awful things that happen in this world, but there is nothing greater than what Jesus did for us on the cross. Encompasses all of those kinds of things. There is nothing so awful that it blots out the Transfiguration or the death of Jesus on the cross. It is absolutely encompassing in its manner. And that's what the church wants to point out to you today. We struggle as we go along through our life, and sometimes we have those periods of times that are dark, uncomfortable. But notice in the reading, if it was the right reading, it says in there, Jesus says to his disciples, this phrase I use with you over and over again. He says, brethren, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. But what he's pointing out is that you and I will make this transition from this life to the new life. And in the Transfiguration, he shows what's going to happen to us, because we are the sons and daughters of the Father, and we are made in the image and likeness of God. So we too will have a glorified body. When this happens, dearest family, we're going to look really, really good. The best you've ever seen, but we're still going to be who we are. And let's make a point right now. We'll have a time when we get together in heaven to discuss what I had shared with you. And you check out to see whether I was correct or not. Is that a deal? We'll check that out. That way, none of you have to think about that hot place. Okay, because that's what worries people, wouldn't you say so? Now, that particular little phrase, after seeing how the apostles reacted, Jesus wants this to be a part of your own life, because he's saying that over and over again. Yes, you may have made a mistake. You may have made an awful mistake, but that doesn't change my love for you. And I need for that fear to be cast out of your lives. You know why that's so important? Because fear blocks out love because of its strong and terrible dynamic. So when we grab a hold of the understanding of this feast, we see the Transfiguration. The apostles see the Jesus of heaven. And then we see him attack the terrible and the awful, and the last thing he needed to conquer, and that was death. Those 3 days were the longest 3 days that ever existed in the world. But Jesus came back to them. And how does he come back to them? As they're gathered in that room, and they are scared to death. Jesus simply says, peace be with you. He doesn't deride them or anything. He knows that they know they've really made a bad choices. They ran away. And then John, reluctantly being there with Mary, the other Mary, and Mary of Magdala. And he says, peace be with you. That peace, that healing peace that comes to us is there so that you and I know that whatever happens in our life, the power is still in the hands of Jesus. No one else can compete. Paul tells us in Romans 8:27, what can separate us from the love of God? Absolutely nothing, not even our worst mistakes. So what do I leave with you today? A familiar phrase to take home and to think about. Do not be afraid, because the love of God is larger than anything that exists. That should be a source of comfort and of hope. He doesn't expect us to be perfect. He expects us to be persons who try to do one loving act after another.